The town lay under a thin veil of dust, the kind that clung to boots and coats, dimming every color into shades of earth. The sun was high but pale, worn thin by autumn, and the wooden fronts of the stores looked brittle beneath it. Elias Crowe sat where he always did on days he had no work in town, on the edge of the livery's porch, the heel of his boot hooked on the step, his hat pulled low. The rocking chair back home waited for him, empty and creaking whenever the wind shifted. He had grown used to silence, to the sharp ache that lived in it, and though the world had moved on since his wife's passing, he had not. When the wagon rattled in from the west road, even the blacksmith paused at his hammer. Dust trailed the wheels like smoke from a dying fire. A woman sat in the bed of it, not upright but folded, shawl wrapped tight, as though she meant to disappear beneath it. Her hair was bound in a single braid, long and dark, and the braid told Elias more than her downcast eyes. It spoke of discipline, of someone who held herself together when the world wanted to scatter her. The driver cracked his whip and pulled to a stop near the trading post. A few men gathered, murmuring. Elias caught pieces, sold off, couldn't feed her, too poor to keep another mouth. Words said carelessly, the way one might speak of livestock brought in from too far afield. She stepped down when ordered, but her feet faltered, and her hands clutched the wagon edge as though she had no strength left. No hand moved to steady her. No greeting came. Just the circling eyes of townsfolk, curious but cold. She was no one's concern. Elias rose before he thought it through. His boot struck the earth, slow and steady, his shadow stretching long across the dust. The girl, no, the woman, wavered when her heel caught a rut. He reached out, weathered palm catching her elbow, steadying her as though she were light as air. For a heartbeat, her eyes lifted to his. Grey, rimmed with fear and shame. He spoke without meaning to, the words pulled up from a place he hadn't touched in years. "You're just right for my arms." It was not a proclamation, nor a boast, just a quiet truth that startled him as much as it startled her. The townsfolk shifted. He heard the whispers start. Crowe, taking her in? Has he lost his wits? Ain't he buried enough sorrow? She's poor stock, not fit for more than kitchen ash. Their words coiled like snakes at the edge of the street, but Elias did not let go. Her shawl whipped in the wind, frayed edges snapping like torn flags, and he kept his grip gentle but sure. She did not thank him. She did not smile. She only stood there, breathing hard, as though bracing for another blow that had not come. Elias straightened, hat brim shadowing his eyes, and looked once at the driver who had delivered her like cargo. No words were exchanged. None were needed. He simply turned, guiding her with the pressure of his hand, away from the gawking crowd. Behind them, whispers grew, a murmur of suspicion and pity tangled together. The widow's cowboy, they said, had let his grief sour into folly. She, the girl sold because she was poor, was nothing but another burden he would one day regret. But Clara, he had heard her name only once spoken, in passing, walked at his side, head bowed, shawl pulled close, her braid swaying against her back. And Elias Crowe, who had sworn he would carry nothing more in this life than silence, felt the first thread of a new weight settling into his arms. Not the weight of sorrow this time. Something quieter. Something that unsettled him more than grief ever had, the fragile seed of belonging, unspoken, trembling, but alive. The ranch was built on silence. Not the peaceful kind, but the hollow silence that comes when every room remembers a voice now gone. The boards creaked in the night as though echoing old footsteps, and the rocking chair on the porch swayed with each gust of wind, as if still waiting for the one who used to sit there. Clara moved through it like a shadow, light-footed, cautious, uncertain how long she might be allowed to stay. She folded blankets too neatly, swept corners no one saw, lingered by the stove as though warmth itself might abandon her if she turned away too long. Elias watched her without meaning to. He would come in from tending the horses and find her standing still, hands hovering over a kettle that had already boiled. Once, he passed through the barn and saw her fingers tracing the old tools hung along the wall. She touched them as though they were relics in a church, her brow furrowed, her braid sliding forward over her shoulder. The way she tied it each morning, tight, without vanity, as if each knot was a promise not to fall apart, took him back to mornings long buried, when another set of hands had moved with similar patience in the dim light before dawn. Nights were harder. The wind rattled the shutters like a hand trying to get in. Elias lay awake with the image of his wife's last smile burned into the darkness, her laughter still clinging to the edges of memory before it broke into coughs that carried her away. Sometimes he rose, sat in the rocking chair, and let it creak under his weight until his chest eased. He did not know that Clara, lying on her narrow bed inside, was awake too, her dreams broken by the memory of her family's voices when they bartered her off. Shame clung to her like a second skin, heavier than hunger had ever been. Neither spoke of these things. Yet the air between them was filled with ghosts. She heard his boots scrape the porch and felt the grief that walked with him. He saw her fingers tremble when she held a piece of bread too long, as though still unaccustomed to food she did not have to earn. Then came the morning when something shifted. Elias poured his coffee as always, black and scalding, and for a moment stood staring at the fire's glow. Without looking at her, he poured a second tin cup and set it on the table beside Clara. No word passed between them. She stared at the steam curling upward, the way it seemed to rise like a prayer, and her hand closed around the cup slowly, as if testing whether it was meant for her. She drank, and in that silence, something warmer than the coffee spread through her chest. Later that week, Elias found his old coat folded neatly by the door. He had not asked for mending, but when he lifted it he saw the tear along the sleeve stitched with careful, even lines. Her work was plain, but steady, and for a moment his throat tightened. He slid his arm into the sleeve and felt the weight of another presence there, not his late wife's, not a stranger's, but something that belonged to this house now. They did not thank each other. They did not speak of it. The words might have broken the fragile thread. Instead, they went on with the rhythm of days, their silence no longer hollow but layered, like smoke curling through beams of light. In the evenings, Clara watched the rocking chair sway on the porch as Elias sat with his hat low, his eyes fixed on the horizon. She did not know what he thought about. He did not know how she kept her hands folded tight in her lap to keep from trembling. But both felt the same truth settle quietly between them. Survival was not only in bread and shelter. It was in being seen, if only in the small ways that no one else would notice. Their scars lay hidden, but like shadows stretching long at dusk, they began to cross each other, lining up until the pain no longer felt carried alone. The storm announced itself long before the rain came. Clouds rolled in like an army, black and endless, swallowing the line of the plains. The cattle grew restless, tails flicking, their hooves shifting in the dirt. Elias stood by the corral, watching the horizon darken, the air thick with that sharp, metallic scent that always came before a downpour. Behind him, the house waited, firelight flickering faint against the shadow of the storm. Clara had drawn water and was carrying it inside when she spotted him. Her braid clung to her shoulder, heavy in the damp air, and she wrapped her shawl tighter around her thin frame. She had lived through storms before, but this one felt different. The air pressed down, heavy with more than rain. Just as the first drops spit against the dust, a rider came. A dark figure cutting across the land, horse lathered and restless, hat pulled low against the wind. The stranger slowed only when he reached the yard, eyes sweeping the place with practiced calculation. His coat was long and travel-stained, his face gaunt, with a grin that showed too many teeth when he dismounted. He asked for water first, voice rough but smooth enough to hide its edge. Then his gaze shifted to Clara, and his smile widened. "Been looking for a girl," he said. "Thin, quiet thing. Ran from folk she owes." His eyes lingered on her shawl, her braid, the way she had gone still as stone in the doorway. Clara's hand tightened on the bucket's handle. She knew him, or men like him, dealers in debts that could never be paid, scavengers who circled the weak. The words runaway and owed struck her like stones. The old shame flooded back, the memory of being sold because she was too poor to keep. She felt Elias' eyes on her, steady, unreadable, but his hand brushed against the doorframe where the rifle leaned. The sky split open then, rain coming hard, drumming against the roof, running in silver sheets off the eaves. The stranger did not flinch, only stepped closer to the firelit threshold, voice lowering. "Best you hand her over. Don't reckon you want trouble dogging your heels. She'll bring ruin, same as before." Inside, the house grew thick with wood smoke and storm air. Shadows leapt across the walls as the fire popped and cracked. Clara stood near the hearth, trembling, feeling the heat on her face while her heart froze. She believed him. She had always believed herself cursed, abandoned by family, marked by poverty, and now bringing danger upon the only man who had shown her a kindness not bought. Elias sat slowly, lowering himself into the chair by the fire. The old wood groaned under his weight. He laid the rifle across his knees, one hand resting calm on the stock. His eyes did not leave the stranger. "This house is mine," Elias said, voice low but carrying through the storm's din, "and she stays under my roof." The thunder answered him, rolling long and deep, rattling the shutters. The stranger's grin faltered for the first time. He leaned back, rain dripping from the brim of his hat, studying Elias as if measuring what kind of man sat before him. But Elias did not waver. The rifle lay steady, his hand unshaking. Clara's throat closed. She wanted to speak, to protest, to beg Elias not to ruin himself for her. But no sound came. Only the sound of the storm filled the silence, rain against glass, wind clawing at the door. She realized then that Elias would not cast her out, not even when danger pressed at his very walls. The stranger lingered too long, letting the storm drench his coat, letting the firelight flicker across his face. His threats coiled like smoke, promises of debts and men who would come asking. But when he mounted at last and rode off into the black rain, the storm swallowed him whole. Inside, Clara sagged against the wall, her shawl damp, her breath ragged. Elias did not look at her. He only leaned back in the chair, the rifle still across his knees, eyes fixed on the fire as though nothing had passed. Yet the word still rang in the air, steady as thunder, unmovable as stone. This house was his. And she was staying. The storm passed in its own time, leaving the earth dark and shining, the air thick with the smell of wet sage and soil. The roof dripped for days, and the corrals turned to muck, but the stranger's absence weighed heavier than the weather. Even after the skies cleared, unease lingered in the rooms of the ranch house. It was not fear of what might return, but of what had already taken root between them. Clara moved through the house with new purpose, though her steps were still light, as if afraid of claiming too much ground. She boiled coffee at dawn, the bitter scent filling the kitchen before Elias came in from feeding the horses. She polished the rifle he kept by the door, running the oiled rag with slow, careful strokes, her fingers respectful of the power it carried. Harnesses worn smooth by years of use were patched under her needle, her stitches plain but steady. These were the tasks of someone who meant to belong, yet she carried them out as though waiting for the moment he told her she had done enough. Elias noticed. He always noticed. He watched the way her braid swung when she bent over her work, the way her eyes flicked to him when she thought he wasn't looking. He showed her how to saddle the mare one afternoon, their hands brushing as he guided her fingers along the straps. The silence between them thickened then, charged in a way neither could name. He pulled his hand back too quickly, and she stepped away, though her eyes lingered on the leather cinched tight beneath his grip. Night stretched long in that charged silence. Clara lay awake, staring at the beams of the ceiling, counting the knots in the wood. She told herself she was only useful here until he tired of her, until he realized she was more burden than help. Elias, sitting out on the porch, rocked slow in the chair his wife once claimed, the sound steady as a heartbeat. He feared his own chest most of all, the way it betrayed him with warmth each time Clara laughed under her breath or looked up from her mending. He had promised himself long ago that grief would be his only companion. Now something else stirred, dangerous as fire in dry grass. In town, tongues wagged louder with each passing day. Some called Clara the bought woman, saying Elias had taken pity where pity would ruin him. Others whispered Elias was a fool, still shackled by the ghost of his dead wife, unfit to start again. Their solitude was no longer private, it was measured, weighed, and gossiped about each time they rode in for supplies. One afternoon, a neighbor stopped by, a man with eyes too sharp and words too slick. He leaned on the fence and spoke as though offering advice. Best return her while you can, Crowe. Trouble's bound to follow her kind. Elias' jaw hardened until the lines in his weathered face looked cut from stone. He said nothing, only turned back to his work, but his silence was colder than any threat. Clara, listening from the porch, clutched her shawl tighter. She had heard every word, though none had been spoken to her. The days after carried a different kind of storm. It lived in glances not held, in words swallowed back. Elias feared his heart was slipping its leash, betraying the vow of solitude he had lived by. Clara feared each kindness was temporary, that one day he would hand her over to the wind as easily as her family once had. Yet in the quiet moments, when she set his coffee by his hand, when he brought in firewood and stacked it near her feet, something unspoken continued to grow. Dangerous, tender, and stronger each time they refused to speak of it. Healing lingered between them like a flame that neither dared touch, though both felt its heat. The dust rose before the sound reached them. Hooves, heavy and sure, pounding the earth in rhythm like a war drum. Elias stepped onto the porch before Clara did, his eyes narrowing against the bright horizon. She followed, clutching her shawl, her breath quickening as the dark silhouettes came into view, 4 riders, one of them the stranger from before. His grin was wider now, armed with numbers, with certainty. They drew up before the house, horses stamping, reins creaking. The stranger tipped his hat as if arriving for supper. "Crowe," he called, his voice loud enough to carry over the yard, "I've come to collect what's owed. That woman behind you doesn't belong here. Best hand her over." Clara's knees weakened, but she stepped forward, shawl gripped tight, her braid heavy against her back. Her voice cracked when she spoke. "I'll go. I won't bring ruin to you." She tried to move past Elias, but his arm shifted, a wall she could not pass. He did not look at her. His eyes were on the men, and when he rose from the chair by the door, it rocked once, creaking as it moved back and forth in the wind. He lifted the rifle across his arms, not pointing yet, only holding it as if it had always belonged there. "You'll not take her," he said. His voice carried no heat, no shout. It was steady as stone, the kind of voice that made men reconsider their laughter. The riders chuckled anyway, low and cruel. One spat into the dirt. "She's marked by debt, Crowe. Best not tie yourself to curses." Elias shifted the rifle just enough for the firelight inside the house to glint along the barrel. His jaw was tight, his eyes fixed. The laughter faltered. The storm that lived behind his silence now stared back at them, and it was not the face of a man easily moved. A shot cracked the air, sudden and sharp. Dust leapt from the ground at Clara's feet. She gasped and stumbled, but Elias did not flinch. His rifle rose, aimed, ready to answer. For a breathless moment, the yard held its breath. Then came footsteps from behind. Doors in town opened. Voices carried. Men who had once whispered on porches and muttered in saloons now stepped forward, rifles and shotguns in hand. Faces Elias had known for years but never relied upon gathered in the distance, silent but present. One man spoke, his voice rough with shame. "Enough of this. She stays." The riders looked around, their bravado cracking under the weight of numbers they had not expected. The stranger's grin slipped for good. He spat a curse, wheeled his horse, and the others followed, their dust cloud retreating across the open plain. Clara stood frozen, shawl clutched to her chest, her heart hammering. She had believed herself a curse, a weight to break any man who carried her. Yet here she stood, untouched, because Elias had risen and the town had followed. Her presence had not ruined him, it had lit a fire in him, and in others too long afraid to act. Elias lowered the rifle slowly, the set of his shoulders easing only when the riders vanished into the horizon. He turned then, at last meeting Clara's eyes. What she saw there was not pity, nor duty, but something fiercer, something alive. She trembled, not from fear this time, but from the shattering knowledge that she was no burden. She was the reason a man had stood, and others with him. The town quieted after that night, though whispers trailed in Clara's wake wherever she went. Folk still talked, as folks will, but none dared challenge Elias again. His rifle across the doorway and the unbending line of his shoulders had said all there was to say. The ranch itself seemed altered by the stand they had made. Firelight burned softer in the evenings, shadows no longer pressing so heavy against the walls. The silence that had once been suffocating now felt like a quilt, warm and close. Clara moved differently in those days. She no longer slipped through rooms like a ghost, bracing for rejection. She began to braid her hair each morning with care, not as adornment, but as a quiet act of dignity. Her hands, once shaking with hunger and shame, grew steady in their work, stitching, tending, polishing brass until it gleamed. When she looked at Elias now, it was without flinching. Elias, too, had shifted. Grief had been his tether for so long he'd forgotten the shape of release. But now, sometimes, when Clara made some small remark, a dry observation about a stubborn mule, a muttered curse at the kettle that always boiled over, he found himself laughing low, the sound rough in his chest from disuse. It startled him the first time, that laugh, as if it belonged to a younger man. Yet he did not fight it. One morning, with the sun still hidden and the prairie wrapped in mist, he saddled 2 horses. Clara came to the yard, shawl loose around her shoulders, and for once she did not ask if she was meant to come. He held the reins out to her without a word. She took them, and together they rode into the waking day. The land spread wide before them, endless and open, smelling of dew and wild sage. The horses' hooves sank soft into the damp earth. Rifles lay strapped to their saddles, not as chains, not as threats, but as reminders of what they had endured and overcome. Clara's shawl fluttered against Elias' coat as they rode, the fabric brushing between them like a tether. There was no master here, no dependent, only 2 riders side by side, bound by survival, by choice. The ride stretched into hours, the horizon rolling away and returning, until they turned homeward with the sun dipping low. Dusk spilled lavender across the fields. Elias lit a lantern as night gathered, the flame catching against the glass. He hung it on the porch beam where it swung gently in the breeze. Clara stood beside him, watching the glow sway, throwing golden arcs across the yard. Her chest rose, trembled. The tears that came were not of sorrow, not of hunger, not of fear. They fell as release, as if some weight she had carried all her life had finally slipped free. Elias said nothing, but his hand brushed against hers as he stepped down from the porch. That, more than words, was the promise, the lantern burning not for guidance, not for warning, but as a vow that she would never again be cast into the dark. The prairie wind sighed through the grass. The horses shifted in their pen. And on that porch, under the swaying light, Clara knew she had found not just protection, but belonging. Elias knew that love had not replaced what was lost, it had grown beside it, a new root in the same hard earth. Together, they stood, two souls weathered by grief and trial, alive, unbroken, bound not by desperation but by choice. On that dust-swept frontier, with shadows behind and wide sky ahead, they had found what both thought forever gone, a second chance.